Well, Richard Painter is Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota. He served as a former chief White House ethics lawyer in the George W. Bush administration. Professor, thank you so much for your time. What factors do you believe have contributed to the rapid spread of these protests across a number of campuses in the United States?
Well, first, I think the younger generation is right to be horrified by the amount of violence in the world, and that we can't settle our differences peacefully without such wars that extract an enormous toll on innocent human life. And this is a very, very legitimate concern. The problem is that protesters who seek to excuse or justify the terrorist attacks by Hamas, or who say the Zionists don't deserve to live, are only adding to the rhetoric of violence that we need to get away from in order to solve the Middle East crisis and crises elsewhere in the world. This crisis will be solved when there is an independent, peaceful Palestinian state that recognizes the existence of Israel, the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state within its pre-1967 borders. There needs to be compromise. There needs to be adherence to the rule of law. And unfortunately, the extremists take over in this environment. Extremists who would talk about eradicating all of the Palestinian people, who would encourage genocide, but also extremists who would encourage genocide toward Jews with chants such as from the river to the sea. So if the younger generation is against violence and war, which I hope very much they are and willing to be very forthright about that, they must condemn all violence, including the violence of October 7, call for a ceasefire and for a reasonable, sensible resolution to the crisis, at least.
What do you think these protests can achieve? You've spoken of the dangers of this becoming an extremist protest, but underpinning the importance of speaking out against the violence that is occurring. Can these protests deliver something tangible?
Protesters who condemn violence, who condemn war, who condemn terrorism, the events of October 7, which had no justification, no excuse. Protesters who unequivocally condemn violence and war will help advance human civilization, help us learn to solve our problems peacefully, which we have to. In an age of nuclear weapons, we need to learn to resolve differences without war, without violence. But attempts to condone, excuse, justify the actions of Hamas, a terrorist organization, will get us absolutely nowhere. No more than justifying the actions of Al-Qaeda on the September 11th, 2001. And we didn't have that going on in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. And that's why a lot of Jewish people are very, very angry right now. And I think rightfully so.
Yeah, and there is concern, and it's such a difficult balance because on the one hand, freedom of speech, freedom to protest is an important right. How do we make sure we don't cross that line, allowing cops on campus, which is massively problematic, or crossing that line, as you've alluded to, into hate speech, into people feeling afraid? How do we get that balance right? And do you believe that the people on various university campuses, both within management and the students organizing these, have got it right or wrong?
Well, I certainly believe that the university administrators need to set a good example by using only the reasonable measures needed to obtain, to assure the safety of their students, and bringing in the New York Police Department to take down tents on the Columbia campus, I believe was excessive. And then they encouraged a lot of more demonstrations around the country. There needs to be a reasonable response to campus protests. Then again, though, I get back to my fundamental concern that there needs to be a separation of the reaction to the criticism of Israel's response to the terrorist attacks from the horrific nature of the terrorist attacks themselves. The 9/11 attack in the United States was horrific. No one would excuse it or justify it. But there was legitimate criticism of the Bush administration. I worked for President Bush. I didn't agree with everything the administration did. In response, to 9/11, and indeed there were many Americans who peacefully demonstrated against the Bush administration. But the fact of the matter is no one sought to justify the attacks on 9/11. But we have had people on our campuses who have sought to justify and excuse the attacks on Israel on October 7. This is just blatant anti-Semitism. This is the kind of thing. It discredits the protesters.
Important point that you're making about getting that balance right and allowing freedom of protest without others feeling unsafe. Professor Richard Paint from the University of Minnesota, thank you very much.